I'll be very quick and brief. My name is Mike Frank, and I'm the director here of the Hoover Institution's DC office. Welcome. And what we're here to talk about tonight is Islamism. We have a working group. It's the Herbert and Jane Dwight Working Group on Islamism and the International Order. Tonight is to talk with our Middle East strategy challenges focusing on Egypt, Iran, and ISIS. The group is co-chaired by Russell Berman, a senior fellow at Hoover, who also teaches at Stanford, and Charlie Hill of Yale University, the other end of this very crowded stage today. And I'm going to turn it over to Russell real quick, and he can set the context a little bit, and the speakers will self-introduce. So, Russell, it's all yours. Thanks so much for being here and coming all the way out.
Sure. Thank you, Mike. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Thanks for coming this evening. The Working Group on Islamism and the International Order at the Hoover Institution promotes scholarship on the impact of Islam, political Islam, on politics, especially but not exclusively in the Middle East. In December, we held a workshop here at Hoover in Washington where we brought together scholars who commented on various aspects of the strategic challenges that the new administration, that frankly any new administration would have faced. And Charlie and I developed a 10-point set of proposals regarding the challenges that the United States faces in the region. These include the assertion that the region is indeed important. This is not a region we want to walk away from, that the United States needs strategic level thinking about how to proceed in the region, about the competition with Russia, with the challenges that Iran faces, and a host of other issues. What we're doing this evening is bringing together three scholars who are commenting on aspects of that proposal paper and bringing their expertise to bear on the challenges that political Islam brings the United States in the Middle East. I'm going to ask each of the three speakers to introduce himself, but I'll just say that Sam Tadros will talk about Egypt, Kol Bunzel will talk about ISIS and jihadism, and Karim Sajapur will talk about Iran. Sam.
Well, that's a double challenge here. I'm supposed to introduce myself. That's one challenge. And of course, the second is to talk about Egypt among giants talking about more important issues in the news. My name is Samuel Tadros. I'm a visiting distinguished fellow here at the Hoover Institution. I'm also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and teach at Johns Hopkins SAIS. My focus is the Middle East, obviously, with a particular interest in Egypt, Islamist politics, and religious minorities. Should we all introduce?
No. Yeah.
Well, so Egypt. In a discussion about Iran and the Islamic State, Egypt seems like a minute detail. The country is obviously not the regional power competing for hegemony to shape the region as a whole, nor is it the greatest threat that the region faces. And yet, here am I today to make an argument that perhaps Egypt is the most consequential decision that the new administration will be facing in the Middle East. Now, to defend this statement, let me start by quoting the late Fuad Ajami. Writing in 2012 at the anniversary of the protests in the Middle East, he said, "The country," about Egypt, "the country may have lost the luster of old, and Arabs may no longer be fixated on that city as they had once been. But this Arab time shall be judged by what comes to pass in Egypt." For a decade and a half since the 9/11 attacks, the policy debate about Egypt and Washington has been divided into two camps. On one side are those arguing that the United States has strategic interests in the country. The free passage in the Suez Canal, special treatment for US Navy there, right of flights over the Egyptian airspace, but more importantly, that the partnership, the strategic alliance between the two countries that Dr. Kissinger had achieved, that many of US presidents and secretaries of state had tried to do before him, was of vital importance to the US. Egypt had played an instrumental role in leading the region through its waves of Arab nationalism and other ideologies. That Egypt could then become the leader in making peace with Israel in a region that would become more friendly to the United States. On the other hand, have been those arguing that terrorism is really driven by internal repression, that we could not blind ourselves to what was going on inside the country, that the internal dynamics of the countries had their impact on the future, that stability that seemed to be there under the Mubarak regime was really unsustainable, and that the profile of human rights and democracy in the country was of vital importance to the United States. Well, I think both of them were wrong. Both of them were driven by an assumption about Egypt that no longer existed. Both imagined an Egypt of the 1950s and 60s that had been the leader, the pace setter of the region, where Arabs would listen to the songs of Kulthum, where they would watch Egyptian movies, where they would read the literature of Tawfiq al-Hakim, of Naguib Mahfouz, of such Egyptian famous authors. That Egypt is no longer there. Instead of being the competitor shaping the region's future, it is now merely part of the competition, if not the greatest prize in that competition between superpowers, regional powers, ideologies, all competing to shape the region's future trajectory. In that sense, Egypt is of vital importance to the United States, not because Egypt is going to play an instrumental role in the Arab-Israeli peace process. It will not. Neither because President Sisi is going to lead to a revolution within Islam. He wouldn't be capable of to do that, nor for any of these regions. But because the fate of that country on the Nile is of vital importance. If Egypt is to fall into the regional abayas that other countries in the region have fallen into, that would be a disaster. Today, Europe is complaining and suffering and trying to deal with a couple of million Syrian refugees. Well, wait until there are 93 million Egyptians knocking on Europe's door. Who would want to have Somalia on the Nile, Libya bordering Israel, or Syria in control of the Suez Canal, where 10% of the world trade passes? All that scenario to be avoided, the United States needs to have an active engagement in the country. Today in Egypt, there is a moment of enthusiasm. Trump's unlikely elections has been greatly welcomed by Cairo. But moments of enthusiasm have visited Egypt often. When President Bush was elected, the region and the president of Egypt was quite happy. They knew his father, of course, and the very fact that Al Gore had a Jewish vice presidential candidate was something to make him a no-starter for these regimes. When President Obama was elected, both the president of Egypt and the population at large felt happy with his election as a break with President Bush's policies. Another moment of excitement is there today. If this moment of excitement would not fall into the same dynamic as the previous ones, then the US needs to seriously think about changing its approach towards Egypt. Let me suggest a few starting points here. First, the major failure, the real failure of the United States-Egyptian alliance after 40 years, billions, tens of billions of aid to the country, is that at the moment of need, where the United States-Egyptian alliance was most challenged, not a single Egyptian was willing to stand up and defend the importance of this alliance. The real failure of the United States and Egypt is its failure to build a constituency within the country. That was not always the case. When Nixon visited Egypt, Egyptians stood in the streets with the millions, expecting that the relationship to America will bring them prosperity. Not that the US can change Egypt for them, but the main focus of the administration is to make the case building a constituency for the United States in the country. Secondly, conspiracy theories about the United States have to be addressed. When these conspiracy theories are not just ideas shared by the man in the street, but are more importantly believed and spread by the president of the country himself, Sisi, and others in his regime, when they claim that the United States is aiming to divide Egypt into separate countries, when they claim that they have stopped a Navy attack by the US Navy and taken the head of the American Sixth Fleet as a hostage during that attack on the country, when that's what they're telling their own population, that's a problem in building anti-Americanism in the country. And more importantly, they're not just doing it for propaganda. It's something they actually believe and shapes their worldview. Confronting anti-Americanism, attempting to the US Embassy playing a role in answering these stories. When Egypt's leading newspapers has a front-page story about what the US Embassy's secret plan is to take Sinai from the country, the US Embassy cannot stand there silent. These stories have to be answered, and those spreading these stories have to be pay a price for that. Neither should they be invited to the US Embassy 4th of July celebrations, nor should they get the nice visas for their wives to go shopping in America. Thirdly, there are partners for the United States in the region, like the United Arab Emirates, which have developed a measure of trust and working relationship with the Egyptian leadership. In attempting to devise a strategy towards the country, we need to work with our allies in the region, who are more trusted by the Egyptians than we are after the years of discontent and trouble in the relationship under President Obama. Fourthly, this gap in knowledge in the disaster of the educational system that the Arab Human Development Report exposed is something that is making any transition towards democracy impossible. Before people think about Egypt becoming a democracy one day, they should ask themselves how a country can become a democracy where the two competing political forces, one believes that President Sisi's mother is Jewish, and thus he is part of the grand Jewish conspiracy against Egypt, with the other side believing that Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, is himself Jewish, and thus part of the grand conspiracy against the country. If these are the two competing political forces, how do you expect a liberal democracy to emerge? Before we actually talk about democracy promotion in Egypt, we should talk about the level of Egyptian education, the kind of ideas that are there in this system, and how we can address them. And lastly, there are about 500,000 Egyptians living in the United States, serving on top of US administration position, as Dina Powell example shows. These people, with their knowledge of the country, these Egyptian Americans, are probably the best asset the United States has in attempting to deal with the conditions of the country. I started with a line from Fuad, so let me end with a line from Fuad. Ancient civilizations, he says in his book, The Arab Predicament, ancient civilizations stir the imagination. They have a kind of malleability that enables others to read into them what they want. They could be hotbeds of revolution or fragile entities ready to be courted and redeemed. They invite those with a sense of destiny. For the past 8 years, the Obama administration has followed a myth of Egypt's transition to democracy with disastrous consequences. It would be a real pity if the Trump administration follows other myths of Egypt, the regional leader, Egypt, the country that will solve the problem of Islamism, or solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and thus fall into the same trap of an Egypt imagined and not an Egypt as it really is. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks to Hoover for bringing me here, and to all of you for coming. Real change of pace. I am Cole Bunzel. That's right, introduce myself. I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton University in the Near Eastern Studies Department, where I am hopefully soon finishing my dissertation on the history and theology of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, including its links to the phenomenon that I will discuss today, which is jihadism or jihadi Salafism. So in addition to that more historical work, I also write on the ideological trends in the jihadi world and follow their social media and other kinds of things online pertaining to the movement. So that's kind of my point of departure. And what I was asked to address today in the essay that I wrote were basically, what is the best way to conceptualize, to think about the challenge posed by such groups as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State? We've gone through phases where we've insisted on calling them terrorists, we've called them violent extremists, we've used terms like Islamism and radical Islam, and the question is, what is the best lens in which to understand these groups? And my contention is, as someone who studies these groups rather closely on a daily basis, despite my mental and psychological health, that the term jihadi is a very useful one, and that it is useful to begin by understanding the terms that these actors use themselves. And the term that they use to self-identify and to, as academics would say, self-appellate, is in fact the term jihadi. And they use other terms related to that, like the jihadi movement, the jihadi current, the more fancy term being jihadi Salafism. And this is something that a lot of people don't seem to understand, and I think there is an insufficient appreciation of the fact. And to be very clear, I'm not talking about the term that I'm sure you're all familiar with, the one mujahid or mujahideen, the singular of which means quite simply a practitioner of jihad or a participant in jihad. These jihadis, when they speak of themselves as jihadis, I really mean they say, we are the jihadiyin, the jihadis. We are the jihadi current, the tayyar al-jihadi, the haraka al-jihadiyya, the jihadi movement, jihadi Salafism, the Salafiyya al-jihadiyya. These are not terms imposed by the national security establishment on the actors themselves. They are from within the movement. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to correct academics working in my field who insist that this is not true, or who put these terms in quotations, mocking the people who study them as having invented them. And just to give one example of how prevalent this kind of usage is, if you look at the memoir that Ayman Zawahiri wrote, it was published just after 9/11. It's called Nights Under the Prophet's Banner, and it's been published a couple of times. I counted in there the number of times he uses the word jihadi or some variant thereof, and it is more than 200 times. I mean, it is a really distinctive element of the phenomenon. And to give you a more kind of concrete example, and this is on page 6 of the paper that I wrote if you wish to follow along, it's useful to read briefly from a quote that is from Abu Mus'ab as-Suri's book, The Call to Global Islamic Resistance, that he wrote in 2005. Abu Mus'ab as-Suri, as you may know, is a jihadi strategist who we picked up in Pakistan, and he was rendered to Syria, and his whereabouts, his fate are unknown today. But he is something of a rather important figure. And he wrote this in his book, which not only deals with what is the best strategy to confront the West and the apostate regimes at home, but also what is the history of our group and who are we? And he says, and I quote, "The jihadis, al-jihadiyun, or the jihadi current, at-tayyar al-jihadi, are those groups and individuals who have taken up the idea of armed jihad against the standing governments of the Arab Islamic world or against foreign enemies, and have adopted a clearly defined ideology based on the principles of God's sovereignty, al-hakimiyya, the principles of association and dissociation, al-wala wal-bara, and the basics," and this is his kind of strange language, "contemporary religio-political jihadi thought as detailed and set out in their writings." So you see here there's a consciousness of a distinct movement that calls itself jihadism, and you also see that he alludes to certain elements in the ideology that constitute the movement. So Hakimiyya, for example, refers to ideas associated with Sayyid Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood radical who died in 1966, who basically theorized the idea of revolution. And that idea would be carried on by his successors in Egypt during the 1970s and 80s, culminating in the assassination of President Sadat in 1981, when a real doctrine of jihad as revolution was born. And for a long time, that was the kind of central ideological focus of the movement. Now, beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, as as-Suri writes here, the movement started to be penetrated by Salafi ideas or Wahhabi ideas coming from Saudi Arabia. And that's why he refers to the term al-wala wal-bara, or association and dissociation. He's referring to ideas that whose provenance are from Saudi Arabia. Also important is he talks about the writings of this group and how they are set out. In fact, jihadism is not something that can be, in my opinion, just kind of considered a sort of bland, formless, amorphous extremism or radicalism. It is something with an important content that isn't to be dismissed out of hand. And it does have people who describe themselves and are described by their followers as scholars, as ulama. They are the scholars of Islam. It's a group, I mean, it's a movement that has scholars and it has a literature. So why is this important? Well, if you see jihadism is a movement, and this is kind of the way that I understand it, it helps to make sense of a lot of the different things that we've been seeing over the past several years, and as I think we will be seeing going forward. So for example, another thing that Abu Musab al-Suri referred to repeatedly in his book is the fact that with the penetration of Salafi ideas into jihadism, you had this growth of intolerance, and it led to the rise of divisions within the jihadi fold. And another jihadi scholar has called this group of young, zealous jihadis who were in Afghanistan in the 1990s, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi being one of them. He's called this the Jalalabad school. The Jalalabad school was very eager to excommunicate and to shun anyone who didn't adopt the strict principles of Salafism. And this is to some degree what kept people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi away from al-Qaeda. So that is why, to some extent at least, Zarqawi did not give allegiance to bin Laden when he was in Afghanistan in the 1990s. There were also other groups that were making more clear excommunication and takfir of even the Taliban. The Taliban was seen as a group that adhered to what is called in Islamic theology Maturidism, which is very different from Salafism and is basically makes your blood licit. So these kinds of ideas would basically migrate to Iraq after the invasion in 2003, and they were the centerpiece of the group that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi founded in 2003. So you can see those divisions that were already percolating back then, and then they really come to the fore in 2013, 2014 with the rise of ISIS. The split with al-Qaeda is split along theological, ideological lines. Those aren't the only lines of division, but they're very important. So that is why you have a kind of a movement that is bifurcated. And when you read the internal kind of jihadi memos, the essays that people are writing, they're writing about kind of the soul of jihadi Salafism and which direction is our movement going. And so a man like Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is kind of the godfather of the jihadi Salafi movement, the scholar at large, if you would, and who lives openly in Jordan for reasons I can't quite understand, and writes all day long. He writes multiple essays every day on his Telegram channel in support of al-Qaeda, and I'll get to that. But so a man like him would say after ISIS, they burned the Jordanian fighter pilot alive, he went on TV and he said, jihadi Salafism is innocent of all of this. So his main talking point was, we didn't do this, this is not part of jihadi Salafism. Now going to today slightly, we're seeing just in the last 6 months to a year, a development of another line or another source of division in this jihadi world. And I've seen a lot of the scholars within this movement, the ideologues, starting to talk about the rise of a third way in jihadism. And one scholar has usefully put this in terms of what he calls the neo-jihadis, where he believes that al-Qaeda is jihadism in its pure form. ISIS represented a departure or a deviation in the direction of extremism. And the new group in Syria that used to be known as Jabhat al-Nusra and is now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham represents a departure or a deviation away from al-Qaeda, but in a completely different direction, in the direction of what he calls moderation, or in their own terms, really dilution. They believe, a lot of these scholars and essayists and others, and including activists who have abandoned the group that was once called Jabhat al-Nusra, they firmly believe that the group left al-Qaeda without the permission of Ayman al-Zawahiri. They took an order from, or they left on permission of a subordinate, not on Zawahiri. This is the argument that they make, and they make it quite stridently and publicly. And so they accuse the leaders of this group of having left al-Qaeda. And they also accuse it of, this group that is Tahrir Hashem, of associating too closely with groups that receive funding from Turkey and Qatar, and in some cases who have even cooperated with the United States. So they believe that there is a kind of a purity test that is not being met. So I still believe, this is not to say that the group that once was the Al-Qaeda affiliate of Syria is somehow more palatable or moderate than it once was. It's simply following a different strategy, which they call, in their own terms, jihad al-ummah, or jihad of the entire Islamic community, as opposed to the jihad al-nukhba, or the jihad of an elite. So they believe that you have to kind of create you have to be in charge of a larger movement than yourselves, and then we can hijack that and use that to our advantage, whereas people like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are much closer to the jihad of the elite form. And I've probably gone over my time, but just in closing, the last thing I'll mention is that there's been a lot of debate in Washington of late about what are we to call the enemy in question, and I don't necessarily think that we must, in all cases, refer to these people that I'm talking about as jihadis in our public diplomacy, but if we do insist on using a term that has Islam or it has something Islamic about it, I think jihadism is a good alternative. Thanks.
Thank you. Karim.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here. I'm Karim Sajidpour of the Carnegie Endowment. I'm a senior fellow at Carnegie, and I think what binds myself and Sam and Cole and really all of us here on the panel is we were all former students and friends of the late, great Dr. Fuad Ajami, who was at the Hoover Institute, including many people here in this audience. And I was a student of Dr. Ajami when I did my master's at Johns Hopkins SAIS, 2001 through 2003, and I still, to this day, it seems like yesterday, some of the quotes and anecdotes he would share with us from class 15 years ago that are still remarkably relevant today. And I think about that quote that youth is wasted on the young and college is wasted on college students. And one of the classes I did take in college was a class on the classics, including Machiavelli. And I must admit, I never fully appreciated Machiavelli until I started to live in and study Middle Eastern dictatorships. It's when it really spoke to me in a whole new way. And so my essay for this series is entitled Ayatollah Machiavelli, How Ali Khamenei Became the Most Powerful Man in the Middle East. And so draw kind of the lessons from Machiavelli about Khamenei's leadership style. It argues that he is a Machiavellian ruler ruling in an Orwellian regime. And the lessons I try to draw from the classics in terms of US policy, many of them come from the late, great Cold Warrior George Kennan, looking at the lessons which the United States used in its approach towards the Soviet Union. But my colleagues have heard me speak 3 times today, so I've actually now going to improvise. So I'm not going to put you guys to sleep, hopefully. And so what I want to talk about is kind of Khamenei's leadership style, the strategies which he employs, the tactics which he employs, and the ends. What is he hoping to accomplish? And in addition to Machiavelli and Orwell and Kennan, one of the interesting quotes I used in this was from the CEO of Amazon.com, Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos was talking about his leadership style at Amazon, and he said, the way I look at Amazon is that we're inflexible about the vision, but we're pretty flexible on the details. And that's how I would describe Ayatollah Khamenei's leadership style in Iran. He's very dogmatic. His worldview is quite inflexible in terms of what he wants to achieve for Iran, the strategic principles of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But how he goes about doing that, the tactics which he employs, I would argue, can be fairly flexible. So that's what I want to talk about. And I would argue that there are kind of 3 ideologies which the Islamic Republic of Iran, which Ali Khamenei has to draw upon to try to project power and influence both in the Middle East and beyond, which is unique for a Middle Eastern autocrat. Some autocrats have maybe 1 ideology, some have 2, but I would argue he's the only one in the region who has 3. The first one, I would argue, is sectarianism. And this is a topic you increasingly hear a lot about in the Middle East. 15, 20 years ago, it certainly wasn't as prominent, but Shia sectarianism is an important tool which Khamenei has to project Iranian power, especially in countries in which Iran has a demographic advantage. That's Iraq, which is majority Shia, Lebanon, either majority or plurality. These numbers are sometimes debated, but Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain to some extent. Syria, Iran doesn't have a demographic majority, and that Alawites and Shiites constitute a minority, but they control power. And other pockets throughout the region, including Yemen, in which Iran kind of uses Shia sectarianism to try to project power. Now, I think for many years, Iran had its cake, was able to have its cake and eat it too, in that it projected Shia sectarianism, it used Shia sectarianism, but it also pretended to be kind of a pan-Islamic power in order to transcend the Sunni-Shia divide and Arab-Persian divide. I think they've no longer been able to do that in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings, in particular the Syrian uprising. 10, 15 years ago, Iran, as Sam can attest to, was probably popular in the streets of Cairo. I remember years ago reading a story that I think every year in Ramadan, the juiciest date in the Cairo bazaar is given a special name, and one year it was the Ahmadinejad date that was among the juiciest dates sold. Iran was quite popular in the Sunni Arab street, but these days I would argue it's increasingly unpopular. But sectarianism is a very powerful tool which Khamenei uses. The second tool which he employs is anti-imperialism, and this is opposition to America, opposition to Israel. For years, as I mentioned, this allowed Iran to transcend that Persian Arab Sunni Shia divide. Iran was popular in Sunni parts of the Arab world. But the anti-imperialism has allowed Iran to go beyond the Middle East. It has allies in places like Pyongyang, Havana, Belarus, as my friend Afshin Molavi calls them, the dream team of countries. But that has been useful for Iran in the non-aligned world. It has allies, it has admirers. I can't tell you how many times I've been traveling in Europe and elsewhere, and young people will voice admiration for the Islamic Republic of Iran because they believe Iran stands up to imperial powers. So sectarianism, anti-imperialism, and the third ideology is nationalism. And in contrast to many of its neighbors in the Middle East, Iran is a nation state which has a 2,500-year history. The late Egyptian scholar and diplomat Tassin Bashir famously said that there are only two real nations in the Middle East, Egypt and Iran, and the rest are tribes with flags. And whether or not that perhaps isn't kind to, I think he was not thinking about Turkey. No, but it's certainly true that there is this incredibly powerful nationalism which exists among Iranians. In fact, about a decade ago, my alma mater, the University of Michigan, has a survey they call the World Values Survey, and they ask individuals around the world, how proud are you of your nationality? And Iran was number one in the world. 91% of Iranians said they were very proud. The United States was pretty high, and it was about 75%. So I don't say this only as something which is positive, obviously. I think nationalism, aggressive nationalism, is a double-edged sword, and that I would argue Iran is doing some horrific things in today's Middle East, including in Syria. And rather than criticize those Iranian actions in Syria, I've seen too many Iranians who are not supporters of the regime but consider themselves to be strong nationalists voice pride about Iranian power in the Middle East. So I do think nationalism can be a double-edged sword. But again, Khamenei has these kind of three ideologies: nationalism, sectarianism, anti-imperialism, which to draw on, and he uses them in different arenas when it's expedient. Now, in addition to these three ideologies, I would argue he has kind of two tactics or two tools. He has a sword and he has a shield. His sword is named Qasem Soleimani, who's the head of the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. And Iranian power in the Middle East is entirely the domain of the Revolutionary Guards. I think someone put it well that there was a time in which Iran used its ideology to project power. Now it's forced to use its power to project its ideology, meaning it can no longer rely on on soft power in the region. It has to rely on its hard power and the Revolutionary Guards to spread its influence throughout the region. And so Qasem Soleimani is the sword of Ali Khamenei. He uses him in places like Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere. But Khamenei also cleverly, I would argue, uses a shield called Javad Zarif, who is the Iranian foreign minister. And Zarif is very effective at blocking external pressure, sanctions, political pressure. Whereas Soleimani goes to cities like Tikrit and Damascus, Javad Zarif goes to cities like Davos and Munich and New York. He's on CNN, he's on Charlie Rose. And I think it's much more difficult to isolate Iran and make the case to countries like China and Russia that Iran is a malign actor when you have this Western-educated foreign minister in Iran. So the two tools are a sword and a shield, Qasem Soleimani, Javad Zarif. Finally, I would say, what is the goal here? What is Iran hoping to achieve with this? I would argue there have kind of been three consistent strategic pillars of the Islamic Republic since 1979. Number one has been hostility towards the United States, what they would call the rejection of American hegemony. Number two has been the active rejection of Israel's existence. And number three, which has really intensified over the last years, has been the rivalry with Saudi Arabia. It's oftentimes perceived as a Sunni-Shia conflict or Arab-Persian. I would argue it's above all a geopolitical conflict cloaked in sectarian and ethnic clothing. Now, finally, I'd like to just conclude about U.S. policy toward Iran, because I think that any U.S. administration is going to have to employ some combination of the three C's, what I call the three C's of Iran policy. And the three C's are cooperate, contain, and confront. You try to cooperate when possible. If you can't cooperate, you contain. If you can't contain, I think there are times when you're going to need to confront. Now, the Obama administration focused heavily on the first two of those C's. They really tried to cooperate with Iran. When they couldn't cooperate, they tried to contain Iran. I would argue the Trump administration is much more focused on the latter two C's, which is trying to contain them when possible, but also thinking about confronting Iran in places like Syria, potentially in Yemen, in the Persian Gulf. And but I think in lieu of any grand strategy toward Iran, we're just gonna have to figure out kind of what combination of those three C's to employ. So I'm happy to stop there.
Okay, thank you. So that's quite an itinerary that we've taken you through, from Egypt through jihadism to Iran, and this is indicative of the work we do in the working group on Islamism and the International Order. You can read our caravan or other essays, books that we publish at the Hoover website, hoover.org. I'd like to open the floor now for questions. All is game, please.
Yes, I'm Russell King. I think I'll direct it. Sorry. Yeah, my name is Russell King. I'll direct this question initially to Mr. Bunzel. You talk about the jihadists, and they're using their own terminology as to what they're actually doing. But I'm wondering if the jihad could sometimes be a cover. Now, I know in Iran, for example, Iran has a very close relationship with the Russian Federation, People's Republic of China, and Japan. None of those countries have any Islamic motive whatsoever. But is it possible that either in the past or the present or in the future, a major country could covertly be colluding with so-called jihadists and even put their agents under cover as a jihadist? Because everything you say about what a jihadist says about himself could be black propaganda if it were a cover. Have you considered that?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of the jihadi groups have shown themselves more than willing to cooperate with and take advantage of any offers of assistance from countries that are, kind of operate in nefarious spaces in the international community, particularly Iran. Al-Qaeda and Iran have a long history together. It's not always been on good terms, by the way, too. A lot of Al-Qaeda's leadership have been imprisoned in Iran, and some remain there. So at least the jihadis say. But in general, the movement that I'm talking about is one that is not kind of directed by another state. It is kind of something that is, a phenomenon in itself. And also, I should be clear that the people who use the term jihadism most are the scholars of the movement who really wouldn't tolerate any kind of associations with groups that are deemed beyond the pale.
Bertie Piacenik. The missing actor here, I think, is Turkey. And I was just wondering from each of you what you feel like the relationship is currently or potentially going to be between Egypt and Turkey and Iran and Turkey, because Turkey is a force, an Ottoman Empire behind it that has to be reckoned with right now.
Could you hear the question in the back? It's about Turkey.
Sure. I was in Turkey less than a year ago, and one of the most things that struck me, sitting with the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the ruling party, was he referred to Syria as once we were the same country. Like, the same country? You were occupying Syria. I mean, that's what you were actually trying to say. The Ottoman Empire was occupying Syria. But he looked at us, we were brothers, we were really the same country. Certainly the Arab Spring came as a welcome to Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He viewed it as he would play a leading role in that. There were movements across the region that were coming to power that looked at Turkey as a model and inspiration for them, whether in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and other places, and certainly in Syria, where he thought that he could really tip the scales and influence the conditions there. Relations currently between Egypt and Turkey are cold at best. Erdogan reacted very unpleasantly to the military coup in Egypt that brought General Sisi to power. He viewed it as similar to what Islamists in Turkey had undergone during the years with the various coups. So he viewed it as something that, from his own lens and his own history, and he's really been the guy leading the attacks on the Egyptian regime's legitimacy. More importantly, Turkey today is a place that hosts over 10,000 Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood activists. We're not talking just about the top leadership, we're talking about various rank and file members of the Brotherhood escaping and going to Turkey. It hosts 4 TV channels, satellite channels, that are targeted to Egypt, run by the Muslim Brotherhood, undermining the Egyptian regime, attempting to incite people against it. So it's really viewed by the Egyptian regime as a clear adversary and an enemy.
So I would just say, when it comes to Turkey and the jihadis, I think that they have a similar kind of outlook as Saudi Arabia does. They see the jihadis as a nuisance, but they don't see them as an existential threat. And that's informed a lot, I think, of Turkey's policy with respect to what's gone on in northern Syria. And originally they, for a couple of years, were allowing just about anybody to transit their territory if they were going to fight the Assad regime. Once ISIS started bombing Turkey, that changed. That policy started to change. But looking toward the future with, and just to clarify, the Turks view the Kurdish issue as their primary concern. Similarly, the Saudis view the Iranian issue as their primary concern. So there's, as in many cases, always another enemy that is greater than that of the jihadis. But going forward, it will be hard to get, I think, a lot of Turkish cooperation and when it comes to what we want to do in Syria, given the fact that we are beginning to arm the group, a group that is basically a subsidiary of the PKK, and I think that we're going to pay consequences for that eventually.
Karim?
So Iran and Turkey are economic partners and geopolitical rivals. So it reminds me of like quarreling Siamese twins, basically. They're next to each other. They need to rely on one another. Turkey imports a lot of its energy from Iran, but they're major regional rivals, especially in Syria. I find it's sad. Turkey's current trajectory is sad because just as a reminder that human beings have to learn their own mistakes. You don't learn from the mistakes of your older siblings. I mean, Iran is next door. It's had a disastrous experiment with theocracy, joining mosque and state. Instead of learning from that experiment, Turkey seems to be unfortunately following in those footsteps. The one thing I'd add about Turkey and Iran is that I think for many Iranians, when they look at the peak of their history, it was the Great Persian Empire 2,500 years ago, and it was actually pre-Islam. It was when Iran was Zoroastrian. So I think for many Iranian nationalists, being an Iranian nationalist kind of downplays the Islamic identity. In Turkey, that's not the case. When the Turks look at the peak of their power, the Ottoman Empire, that was when they were an Islamic caliphate. So I think I would argue Islam seems to sit a little bit more comfortably in Turkey than it does in Iran. And I think these some of you may have seen the videos yesterday of Erdogan's thugs beating people up on Massachusetts Avenue, which was really horrific. So I think it's to the extent I know that our administration is very focused internally, but I think it's important to stand up to those types of thuggish actions.
Let me just add a comment. The discussion so far has been internal to the Middle East, but of course there are other vectors. There's the relationship to Russia, the relationship to the United States, and the relationship to the EU. The European relationship to Turkey has become a sore point. It began particularly with the crackdown on journalists and intellectuals. Then the referendum led to interesting electoral phenomena in Europe. The Turkish exile population in Europe voted very strongly for Erdogan, for the reform, and now the relationship between Germany and Turkey is in free fall, which, aside from any evaluation of the substance of it, is a major issue for the United States, since these are really the two pillars of NATO's military power. Sir.
There's a microphone. My question goes to Karim. Despite the fact that I'm Russian, my question will probably not relate to Russia, which is, by the way, an elephant in the room. America is being ejected from the region. My question is related to Iran. In your article, alluding to Machiavelli and, painting the picture of a leader who actually has been pretty strategic about his actions. I looked through it and I started thinking about the American policy toward Iran, starting from the Islamic Revolution. The policy of sanctions, in my very humble opinion, just like with Russia, for example, has completely backfired. One thing it has created a nation that has a really unbreakable resolve. The other day, I actually have been to Stanford, and when we talked to Angela Stent, I asked her, what is going to be the impact of sanctions on Russia? And she said, the economy is going to shrink, and you can't eat nationalism, she said. Right? So this is the thinking in this town. You think that, okay, you can exert certain pressure on the economy, and then the people are going to switch sides and you're going to win them over somehow, despite actually actively hurting them economically. You're probably going to create a constituency, a people, a nation, an identity that's built around the idea of resistance. Right? My question is, does American foreign policy arsenal at this point has anything that is actually going to attract Iranian people away from this regime and not coalesce them around this regime?
Okay, thank you.
So
Karim.
I think that the challenge, and it really is a challenge, these are not, there's no silver bullets, there are no easy answers, but I think that the paradox and the challenge of US policy toward Iran is that on one hand there are certain things that Iran does. It's opposition to Israel's existence, its nuclear ambitions, its activities in the region, which, I say that the worst elements of the Iranian regime in some ways emulate North Korea, and the best elements of Iranian society aspire to be like South Korea. And so the challenge here is that to prevent Iran from becoming North Korea, or to push back on Iran's regional activities, it requires economic and political isolation. But to help the Iranian society become like South Korea, I think as you alluded to, requires political and economic integration. These policies are totally at loggerheads. So how do you prevent the regime from becoming North Korea? help the society become like South Korea. And the analogy, it's a bad analogy, maybe you can think of a better one that I think about, is when you're trying to attack cancerous cells with chemotherapy, you hurt a lot of the healthy cells as well. And I think the sanctions regime against Iran, I think it played a crucial role in forcing them to compromise on their nuclear program, but it also hurt a lot of the Iranian body politic. And again, I think that the hardliners in Tehran, they're isolationists, like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, like Fidel Castro was in Cuba. They don't want to be integrated with the outside world. They believe their power is best preserved in a closed environment, and in some ways by isolating and sanctioning them, that's more of a carrot than it is a stick. But the challenge, I think, and we discussed this today when we were at Congress and speaking to people in the White House, is very tough. If you're Vladimir Putin or you're Ali Khamenei and you're not term limited and you can think in 10 or 20-year time frames, you can afford to be strategic. If you're a member of Congress and you're thinking about things in either 10, 2-year, 4-year, 6-year term, you can't really be strategic. You're thinking short-term tactical, and you say, okay, my short-term tactical goals are to push back against Iran in the Middle East, to push back against Iran's nuclear program, and I'm not thinking about a 10, 20-year plan to turn Iran into South Korea. So that's, I think, a fundamental disadvantage that democratic governments have.
This is a question for Karim Sajid, something you said in passing that I want to bring up. You said that you feel Erdogan is going in the Iranian direction of a sort, which I don't see at all. I see he's more of a nationalist thug in the Putin model in certain ways. He's an Islamist, whatever the term means, and he wants he supported the Brotherhood. But I don't really see him as setting up a theocracy. He wants a religious Turkey, but most of all, he wants power. So I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Well, I'm happy to respond briefly, but I've been dominating so I want to hand it over to Cole and to Sam. I would say the following, which is, oh, sorry. No, I just was going to respond in 2 sentences, which is to say, I very much agree with you that his goal is power and he's a thug, but in pursuit of those aims, I think the constituency which he relies on are the religious traditional classes in Turkey, and so that may be something he has to concede to them if he is going to be able to continue to rely on them as a stable constituency. But I would be curious to hear my colleagues on this.
Let me collect a few. I see a few hands, and our time is running short. I'm going to ask you to. I'll collect a few questions, if you could be brief, and then I'll have the panelists answer them all together. Ma'am?
Hi, Rachel Oswald. My question is about Egypt, and what would be different with the geopolitical struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia if Egypt wasn't in the weakened state it currently is? And is the regional influence that Egypt lost forever lost? Has Saudi Arabia permanently kind of filled a void? That void?
Okay, and this gentleman over here, please. And
my name is Marcus Montgomery. I also have a question about Egypt. Mr. Judge laid out some early steps that the Trump administration could take. It kind of seems like they're more or less dependent upon a workable relationship between Trump and El-Sisi as far as building constituencies. If El-Sisi shuts us out, that's not going to happen. So do you see us being able to do this, or do you see El-Sisi and Trump falling out before that can be enacted?
Okay, one more here, please.
Karim, could you share your thoughts on the upcoming Iranian elections?
Okay, 2 Egypt, 1 Iran. Sam, you win.
Okay. The day Egypt lost its the Arab Cold War, I think, was the Khartoum conference in '68 when 68 or late '67 when Nasser goes to Khartoum. The conference is, of course, famous for the 3 no's: no to negotiations and recognition of Israel and all of that. But Nasser said a yes during that conference, and that yes was to Saudi Arabia. Egypt was going to stop the Yemen conflict and it would raise the white flag, basically. We had lost the battle with the Saudis. Egypt could no longer afford to have this Arab Cold War going on as after the humiliation of '67. From that moment onward, I think Egypt gave up on the dream of becoming the regional pace setter. In fact, Egypt, as going back to Professor Ajami, had been the last country in the region to join into this Arab thing. We were the latecomers, we became the leaders, but Egyptian nationalism, our own sense of we're different, we're the first modernizers, we're the grandchildren of the pharaohs, all of that, had always pushed against this role of the Arabs and their troubles. What do we have to do with these troubles of the world? Of course, we also have limited resources to do so. But specifically regarding Iran and Saudi Arabia, I think it's a mistake to view Egypt as a Sunni power, just as it was a mistake to view it as an Arab power. Egypt doesn't think of itself as Sunni. The word is meaningless in a country where the Shiite presence is nearly non-existent. In the Levant, in the Gulf, the word Sunni and Shia means something to the population. For the people of Egypt, yes, once upon a time we were in fact Shia when the Fatimid Caliphate was based in Cairo, but this distinction, these divisions within Islam don't mean the same thing in Egypt. So I don't think that Egypt could ever play the role of the Sunni counter to Iran, not just because of the weakness of the country and its resources, but also because it doesn't think of itself in these terms. And of course, the Saudis were the first to discover this after the billions of dollars that they gave to the Sisi regime with his reluctance to support their position in Syria and to get involved in Yemen. Regarding Trump and Sisi, President Sisi got the best thing, the most important thing he wanted. I don't think I'm saying a secret when I say that officials and scholars who met with him in Cairo, they were told there was a list of priorities Egypt wanted from, yeah, we want certain kinds of weapons to fight jihadis and all of this, but ignore all this. The most important thing Sisi wanted was a red carpet welcoming in the White House, something that Trump had denied him, that Obama had denied him, and Trump gave it to him. Now, I'm one to think that it was unwise to give it without a price, that you could have extracted something from him. I thought that more importantly than talking about human rights, they won't change in the country. Make him give a speech to talk about the role that the United States has done for Egypt. To say that these conspiracy theories are nonsense, that he is a believer in the importance of that alliance, and that's the price for him to come. But he came, and he loved it, and President Trump was able to get an Egyptian American jailed for 3.5 years unjustly in Egypt released because of that relationship, and they love him in Cairo. He's not Obama, and that's more than enough for them for this moment. How long this continues, as Egypt demands more, as it wants the cancellation of the cash flow financing, the restrictions Obama had done on that, as it wants more aid and more money for the country, as the Trump administration is not enthusiastic about foreign aid in general, there are certainly going to be disappointments along the road. But at least today, at this moment, President Trump would win the elections in Egypt without competition.
The election.
So the elections in Iran. So I have 2 sound bites, CNN sound bites about Iranian elections. One is that they're unfree, unfair, and unpredictable. And the other is that they're designed to produce maximum drama and minimum change. So it's a circus-like atmosphere every 4 years in Iran, but as you know, it's a very, very narrow pool of candidates, Tom Friedman says it's Mr. Black, Mr. Black, Mr. Black, and Mr. Gray. Hassan Rouhani is the Mr. Gray. So it's now a two-man race, and you don't have to be gender neutral when you talk about Iranian politics. It's only men who are allowed to run. And it's the incumbent, Hassan Rouhani. The incumbent has won every presidential election in Iran since the revolution. So the incumbent Rouhani versus a very hardline cleric called Ibrahim Raisi. And it's really, I think, a choice between the status quo and status quo ante, going backward in time with Ibrahim Raisi. As I said, I think this is a young, modern, vibrant population that wants to be South Korea, not North Korea. I think if it's up to them, Rouhani is their default choice, not because they love him, but he is the least bad option that they have. The big question is whether the regime will try to rig the outcome in favor of Raisi. Given what they did in 2009 and the popular backlash, they may be hesitant to do that. On the other hand, I sometimes worry that a combination of factors may make them overconfident this time, because they feel like, in 2009 they did successfully crush the population. At the same time, Iranians look at their television sets, they see tumult in Syria, Iraq, elsewhere. Maybe the regime feels the population is not keen to rise up. The United States is so internally focused and focused on American interests, not values, that they may feel that the world is so distracted and their own people are so kind of fearful that they can get away with rigging it. A friend of mine in the room who will go unnamed predicted to me that Raisi will win, and I think it's really, we shall see.
Okay, I want to leave some time for informal discussion. Well, somebody else, you've already, here, please, Bassam, and then the short one.
I just have one question about the jihadis. Why do people follow them?
Why do what?
Why the Muslim people follow these jihadi groups? I'm a Syrian. I know Syria very well. I know Hitler very well. Until today, I don't know the answer. I don't find the right answer. When you mention Abu Mus'ab al-Suri and Abu Mus'ab al-Maqdisi, all these scholars, they have really tough writing. It's not easy to read, not easy to understand. I don't think this local, they can read this. I don't see this scholars are affecting this people. There's something missing. I don't know if you have the answer.
Okay, and a short one, and then it's it.
Short one is with regard to the current Syria truce. What percentage would you back the agreement between Russia and the United States? Which groups are okay to work with, and which ones are unacceptable? And there's no such thing as moderate terrorists, as it turns out.
Okay, cool.
Was that last one to me?
Or, yeah, as was the former.
Well, as to the first one, what is attractive about this ideology? And I think that it is only attractive to a very small minority of people, but those people are extremely motivated. And so when a kind of an opening occurs in Syria or Iraq, they are the first people to try to take advantage of it. And so when they overrun a territory, as in Idlib or in other parts of Syria and Iraq, they institute their rule, and they they destroy the shrines, and they are intent on basically teaching people, indoctrinating people into their ideology. So that's one thing. And most of the people living under, for example, Nusra control in Idlib, I don't think are committed, other than superficially, even in those cases, to the jihadi ideology. But I do think that the scholars, they do matter. And just to give an example, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is just a guy in a white robe sitting in Jordan somewhere, with no official position, no official al-Qaeda affiliation, he is widely respected by people who have taken up arms in Syria and in Iraq. So when he was criticizing in the past few weeks very vehemently the recent actions taken by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or what used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, this issued a issued in a response written by the chief Sharia official of Tahrir Hashem. It was 26 pages long, point by point, trying to refute Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi and why he was accusing us of diluting the methodology. We haven't diluted anything, yada, yada, yada. But one thing that he said in there was interesting. He said that you have to be careful about what you're saying, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, because people listen to you and you could create defections in our ranks. And it seems that he actually has created some. As for what groups in Syria,
what odds do you give the agreement now?
What percentage would you back the agreement between Russia and the United States? Which groups are okay to work with and which are...
the agreement between Russia and the United States, or the one in...
The Astana.
The Astana is...
Yes, the Astana.
I mean, we're not party to that truce. It's Iran,
Turkey
and Russia, and I mean, I don't give it a very strong chance of succeeding.
17.5%.
Yeah. No, I think that if anything, what it'll do, and if it gets put into effect more, the more hardline groups in Syria are going to try to attack as they did before the less hardline groups, and so you'll have more infighting. And but other than that, I don't see anything else really happening.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you.